Good morning, Atlanta. I'm Ian Walters, the Communications Director for the American Conservative Union, and what an opportunity it is to get to partner with our friends from NFRA again, the Republican wing of the Republican Party, right?
I'm not Ian Walters.
We are joined,
I'm his father.
and it's true. Full disclosure,
There's no conflict of interest here.
Ralph C. Hallow is my dad, and so this is a real pleasure to be able to get to talk to him in this kind of format. What do you do for a living, Dad? Ralph C. Hallow?
Tell everyone?
Tell everyone.
Okay. I write, and I talk about politics and the philosophy of conservatism and stuff like that.
Now, one of the reasons that we wanted to set the tone by talking with you this morning was because of your rich history and life experiences. You were not always a conservative. How did you arrive at becoming a conservative?
Wow.
Or at least an expert in
I'm
conservatism?
glad you're all seated. I started out as the only living Marxist on the planet, an independent pro-Soviet socialist.
What year? What year are we talking
This is
about?
in the late 50s, early 60s, when I was in undergraduate and through several graduate schools. I had read all of Marx and all of Engels and had professors who claimed to be Marxists, and I knew they hadn't read all of Marx and all of Engels, had read very little. I like the idea of socialism, of people having good health care and having their basic needs satisfied, and it just seemed like a nice thing. It seemed like the Christian thing to do. Some people are born stupid. Apparently, I was one of them. Then I became a journalist after 3 graduate schools, and my publisher for my second newspaper sent me abroad to East and West Europe, and I got to see communism up close. I remember spending a long time, it seemed like a long time, in Ceausescu's Romania. Nicolae Ceausescu was one of the worst, most horrible dictators in the communist world. And by the time I got out of Romania, out of Bucharest, I took a flight to Frankfurt and on a communist airline, and then from there was able to get on an American airline. And going from the airport to the plane, in those days you walked on a red carpet on the tarpaulin, and then you mounted stairs to the aircraft. So I'm in a suit and tie, and I have a portable typewriter in one hand and a notepad in the other, and just a long line behind me. I stop, hold up the line, I get on my knees, and I kissed the carpet, because to me it represented the United States, and I had learned something about what a police state is like, and for the first time really appreciated my country, America. Around this same time, Richard Nixon, whom the left hated, they thought he was their nemesis. He was the quintessential right-winger, they regarded him as. He was facing stagflation, so his solution was to declare wage and price controls. And I thought, well, that's great, because I was taught that's the answer, that's the solution. The government gets involved and solves the problem. And then I noticed the goods began disappearing from the shelves. things were a lot worse. And I said, well, there's something wrong here. I don't know what the hell I'm talking about when it comes to economics. So I got on the phone, and as an editorial writer for a major metropolitan newspaper, I could call any economist in the world or in the United States government and get his or her time to explain to me what economics is all about. And I did that. And over several years, I learned free market economics. And that became my focus. And for years, I wrote editorials with the concentration on economics, international and domestic. That's how I had this glacial move from the left to the right. Does that answer?
That's a pretty good answer. Yes, feel free to clap. That's quite a story. One of the things, I find fascinating, we are obviously of two different generations. 1950s and 60s happen. We, as a nation, push back against communism in Korea. This is the post-World War II world in America. The argument was the same argument when we went to Vietnam. Ronald Reagan comes along and in '87 says, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." In '91, the wall comes down. This is one of these pivotal events that I remember as a young man. I think I was in 8th grade at the time. And it was a moment for celebration. And you and your peers said, "I never thought I would see this day." And you remember the images of them taking the sledgehammers to the Berlin Wall. Really joyous imagery and joyous celebration of freedom. When the USSR collapsed, this was supposed to be the end of authoritarian communist and socialist dictatorships in Europe, and was supposed to signal the fall of these things across the globe. It was the beginning of the end. And somehow, we find ourselves in a position 30 years later, 2019, on the verge of 2020, fighting the same fight, and not in Eastern Europe. What's someone who's now in their 40s to make of it? And do you think that your granddaughters, who I know you love tremendously, who are upstairs right now, that their inevitable destiny is
1-year-old and 3-year-old.
that they'll be fighting the same fight that you fought, that I fought, and that it's their destiny to fight the same fight?
Okay, so it's true confessions time. I should take partial responsibility for this.
A little closer with the microphone.
I should take partial responsibility for this. We helped defeat communism in Eastern Europe. We thought that as China loosened up and adopted some market economics, it would also adopt freedom as a governing philosophy. It didn't. More interesting in a way is the drift to the left in America. So that, as we all know, a lot of young people think socialism is a grand idea. Well, how did this happen? I remember when I was leading a leader on the left. I left the Socialist Party, Social Democratic Federation, Young People's Socialist League, took half the members with me to form something called the Pittsburgh New Left, the first left-wing organization in the United States that wasn't the Communist Party, that admitted members of the Communist Party. Socialists hated communists and vice versa.
Were you a commie?
I was not. I was twice invited into the Communist Party of the United States of America by the then regional political director. We'd have arguments all night at his living room, and the sun would come up and I'd leave and I'd put my hand on the doorknob to open the door to leave, and he'd say, "Have you thought of joining the vanguard of the proletariat? We would love to have you." And I said, "Look, you can take all of the members of the Communist Party in the United States and put them in a phone booth and shoot a cannonball through it, not hit an intellectual." Herb, the guy's name was Herb Kransdorf. Not really, but I enjoyed arguing with you. Okay, I was not a member of the Communist Party, had no intention of joining the Communist Party, but nonetheless volunteered that I was an independent pro-Soviet socialist. So the people that I associated with were including, by the way, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. Some of you may remember SDS. These people, it turned out, were genuine Marxists, at least in their minds. And they were out to change America into a Marxist nation. They took over much of the university faculty throughout the United States and cultivated students to follow their lead. I should have known this was going to happen, and I was blind to it. I remember my professor, when I think this is my third graduate school, I think. I was doing a doctoral dissertation on Eastern Europe. And the title of the paper I did was the epistemological divergences between Marxism and the scientific method. Heavy, right? Right. So my professor, who had fought in the Spanish Civil War on the commie side, as many Americans did in those days, I knew damn well. I put my heart and soul into day and night for a year and a half into this paper. And I knew the son of a bitch never read it. When I asked him what he thought of it, he said, well, you did a yeoman-like job on it. And he wouldn't discuss it. And at no time when I asked him questions about what Marx said when he wrote this letter to Dr. Klugelman, he didn't know what the hell I was talking about. He didn't care. He was a Marxist because he was a revolutionist, because he hated capitalism and he hated capitalists, and that's all he needed to know. Professor, this guy carried the title professor, had written books, was respected throughout the academic community. And he wasn't really a professor in that sense. And he would have given me my doctorate if I had never written a word, because I was on his side. I was on the side, on the anti-American, well, I was never anti-American, but on the communist side. There were a few leftists in the United States who loved America, but thought it should transition to a more socialist organization of the economy. But most communists, in fact, every communist I ever met, was an American hater and was ready to sell out the United States to the Soviet Union, and is ready to sell out the United States to the People's Republic of China. And I guess, in a way, the most important lesson I learned is that what the adults were telling me when I was growing up about the evils of communism were actually true. It wasn't just government propaganda. It wasn't my elders wagging their finger at me, telling me to behave. They were right. And it's a joyful and painful awakening that I'm privileged to have. I think that's the way to say it.
Wow. Will, what's at stake? Let's say, and we'll talk about this more in the afternoon. How does America change with a President Bernie Sanders, with a President Elizabeth Warren?
How would it change?
How would America change?
Well, making predictions is my forte. I said that the Soviet Union would never disappear without a major war. Impossible.
This is the guy who predicted President Phil Gramm, President Rick Perry. So,
right. And right. On the night of the election in 2016, presidential election, I had prepared for page 1, above the fold, a story, the lead of which was why Donald Trump lost. So when it comes to
you're not the
predictions,
only one. You're not
anything
the only one.
I tell you, take it to the bank with the opposite bet. What was the question?
President Bernie Sanders.
I think both she and he are phony socialists. I think they know how to appeal to a segment of the electorate that will get them the nomination, they think. I think once in power, they will be almost as pragmatic as every other president we've had, with the exception of Donald Trump. In my view, he is the only president who makes sense because he makes no sense. He's not a politician. He doesn't listen to advice from his aides. He acts impulsively, and almost always it's the way genuine conservatives would wish their president to act. Not always, but almost always. And so there's only one Donald Trump. I can't imagine a replacement for him on the right. On the left, it's pretty easy to imagine the two people you mentioned, and this is not to go farther than this room. We don't have any.
Yes, we do.
Oh, we do. Oh. Let me see. Okay. So Republican presidents have differed from Democratic presidents in significant ways. Well, in one significant way. Republican presidents were Republicans and Democratic presidents were Democratic. Other than that, on foreign and domestic policy, there has been little difference, in my view. So that there has been a steady drift to the left, to the state being responsible for everything we do and say, and telling us what we may do, what we may say, what we may buy, what we may not buy. Trump is the only one that has said that's enough of that. I don't see Bernie Sanders being that much different from, I'm not going to name names, but you feel than Obama or Clinton or the rhetoric will be more socialist, more leftist. But there is in a sense, there's a kind of ruling elite, clique in the United States. They all get the same joke. They all understand what needs to be said to be regarded as serious leaders. Some with much more emphasis on left-wing rhetoric, some with more emphasis on right-wing rhetoric. I've known these people, I've traveled with them, became friends with some of them. George W. Bush, for example, and his father. George W. Bush, one of the nicest human beings I've ever had the privilege of meeting. But he's a Bushy, and that makes him slightly different from a Clinton, but only slightly different. And I suspect that the people in this room don't differ very much from me on this view. Does that answer your question?
I think that's pretty good.
Yeah?
I think I've heard that before. You know, one of my bosses, Dan Schneider, was out here earlier, and my other boss, Matt Schlapp, who is in Brazil, hosting CPAC Brazil. We define conservatism at the American Conservative Union, because that's our job at ACU. We define conservatism as the political philosophy that sovereignty resides in the individual, in each person, that your rights are God-given and exist in each one of you by virtue of being a human being. Whereas folks on the left may make the argument that your rights are given to you by the state. And that's very much the distinction that we're hoping to highlight throughout the event of this conference. What is the appropriate role of government or of the state in people's lives? And we'll touch on it on all sorts of issues throughout the day. One thing Matt Schlapp told me, who is an advisor to President Trump, he came, I think we may have all been together, but he spent some time with the president and he said, my gosh, we've got a president who talks just like Ralph Z. Hallow, and I love it. Dad, I hope I'm as good a dad as you were to me. You obviously shaped my values, and I hope that I can do the same for my kids. Folks, please, a nice round of applause for Ralph Z. Hallow.
Okay.